gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution is not going to get that man today. No, because I'm going to get him.
Welcome to this edition of the Hagmann Report. Doug Hagmann, Joe Hagmann together, the premier father-son investigative reporting team, broadcasting proudly on Global Star Radio Network and Blog Talk Radio, also seen live on YouTube on YouTube as well. And Kevin Shipp, the former CIA officer and anti-terrorism expert, had held several high-level positions in the CIA. He was assigned as a protective agent for the director of the Central Intelligence. Imagine that. Counterintelligence investigator, team leader protecting sensitive CIA assets from assassination, manager of high-risk counterterrorism center protective operations, lead instructor for members of allied governments, internal staff, security investigator, and polygraph examiner tasked with protecting the CIA from foreign agent penetration. He's well needed today, believe me. Now, I'm not going to read his entire resume, but suffice it to say this man is an authority. He knows of what he speaks. So we're anxiously awaiting this presentation tonight. And our thanks go out to Mr. Brent Bolesky, who I had the opportunity to speak with today. And what a great man, Mr. Brent Bolesky. And of course, the website for Kevin Shipp and the entirety there is realnewswars.info. That's realnewswars.info. Kevin, we're going to give you the floor and not interrupt you whatsoever, and just ask you to give us your presentation of the deep state versus the shadow government, or the shadow government and its subset, the deep state. Tell people the difference and just go through what you went through, because I think it's probably the most powerful, informative, and necessary presentation on the internet right now.
Well, thank you, Doug. And I guess on your end, they're going to advance the slides as I go along?
Yes, sir. Eric is at the ready with the slides. So, and I just want to tell people again, if you're just joining us, if you're via Global Star Radio Network, please tune into YouTube after you're done listening on Global Star. If you're driving or whatever, or on BTR, tune into YouTube, and the slide presentation will be there. And by tomorrow, it will be segmented in a standalone presentation by itself. Mr. Kevin Shipp, thank you so much for joining us, and take off when you're ready.
Thank you, Doug. And Eric, as you'll see, each bullet on the slides, you'll have to click on that to advance as I talk to each bullet throughout each of the slides, just so you know as we get going here. As Doug has introduced, and the speech I gave in California, this is, I think, no doubt, probably the most important talk I've ever done. And it's certainly, I think, the most risky for me personally. But we can all see what's going on now in Washington. Many of us have known this for years, that there is an unconstitutional secret government, I call it the shadow government, that functions behind the scenes in Washington. It controls the Congress. I'll get into that in detail. It controls the President of the United States and also the judiciary. This is an unconstitutional government that is essentially running our country and even beyond. So next slide, please, Eric. Now, I always like to begin with reminding everyone that the Constitution is not just a piece of ideology. It's not just a philosophical document. It helps to remember that the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land in the United States. It trumps the entire criminal justice system. So if someone, and that includes a government official, violates the Constitution, they are breaking the law. That is a felony or multiple felonies. So I want people to remember that our Constitution is our supreme law. And if government officials violate that, they need to be held accountable. Next. Now, I make the distinction. You hear a lot of talk about the deep state. I guess now that it's safe. There were some of us talking about the deep state back in 2012 when it wasn't so safe, and it was just us and the crickets. But we felt it was very important that people understand what's going on here. You hear a lot of talk about the deep state. I want to make the distinction. Of course, I come from the belly of the beast, from the inside, and I want to make the distinction that there is a difference between the shadow government or the secret government and the deep state. They are intricately connected in a matrix, but they're not one and the same thing. The shadow government is the secret intelligence agencies, specifically the CIA and the NSA, that operate with impunity outside the Constitution. They coerce, intimidate Congress and also the president, and they bind corporations within the deep state with classified contracts, bind them from talking about anything that they see, and essentially take control of their lives professionally and outside. So the shadow government, it manipulates even the deep state. I'm going to get into 2 slides where I kind of break those two down. I just want to stress that they are 2 different entities, the shadow government and the deep state, but they're connected together in a pretty complicated matrix. Next slide. Okay, now it looks like all the information is up there, so that we're not going to have to click through one by one. That's good. You can see this is the shadow government. This is the monster that has been created since 1947, 1948, that has been created, that is the vast system of secrecy that essentially is running our government behind the scenes. These are unelected officials. For example, the CIA was not created with congressional approval. It functions outside the Constitution. We'll talk about that in detail. But let me break down some of the components of the shadow government. Each one of these agencies functions under the cloak, and I want to stress the power of secrecy, just to show you the massive size of this thing. We'll start down at the bottom right with the Director of National Intelligence, who oversees the 17 intelligence agencies. That's 17 intelligence agencies that operate in the secret, the cloaked part of our government. Now, they try to tell us that the DNI now controls the CIA instead of the CIA controlling these other 17 agencies. That is not true. The CIA is still in control of these other agencies. You have the Department of Homeland Security and its secret components, the Department of State and its secret components. We saw that when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was secretly running guns into Libya and Benghazi using Saudi Arabia and Qatar as cutouts. We have the Defense Intelligence Agency, or the DIA. They were intimately involved in the torture program and took it to an extreme. We're under investigation. The DIA was trying to get the authority to recruit Americans within the United States. Over to the left there, you have the National Reconnaissance Office. The NRO is the office that puts the satellites, the spy satellites, up into orbit, into the atmosphere. To the left of that, you have the National Counterterrorism Center, which is the new center created to combat the amorphous threat of terrorism. They have tremendous components of secrecy there. Up from that, you have the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, or NGA, and it is the NGA that gave us, believe it or not, Google Maps. The NGA was intimately involved with Google in the production of Google Maps, so it's not just Google that can see down and see our cars and our swimming pools. That was created via government intelligence satellites. The FBI, as we all know, since the Patriot Act, has its own secret components. They are engaging in warrantless searches of Americans' homes, up to 4,000. We got the FBI Director, Robert Mueller, to admit after fabricating 3 times. We got him up to 4,000 times. And when he was pressed on it further, he said he couldn't remember the number of times the FBI has entered an American's house without a warrant. Couldn't remember. This is the directive of the FBI. Slide over to the right hand of the slide, and you'll see JSOC, just above DNI, the Joint Special Operations Command. That is the President of the United States Secret Army. Most people don't know that exists. It's a secret army that the President can quietly send out into any foreign field to engage in special operations, and that includes the use of lethal force. Up above that, you've got the National Security Agency. We'll talk about that later. And now the NSA is directly connected to Silicon Valley. As we have seen, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and on it goes. The NSA is using Silicon Valley as its backbone for surveilling U.S. citizens. Let's slide over to the left to the CIA. I have that italicized. I consider the CIA the central node of the shadow government. I'll explain why that is later on in the presentation here. Now, the CIA was created out of the Council of Foreign Relations. Established in 1921, the CFR was behind the creation of the CIA. The CFR was also staffed by major members of the mainstream media. That's what I mean by MSM there. And that includes Philip and Catherine Graham of the Washington Post, who were members of the CFR and were part of Operation Mockingbird, publishing information on behalf of the CIA to change public opinion within the United States. So this is the shadow government. You can see the size of this massive system of secrecy. I'm going to break this down into detail later on and just show you the shocking power that this system has over our elected government. Next slide. Okay, now here we have, you can see the shadow government feeds down into the deep state in white letters there. And under the deep state, I've got the system behind government. You notice that the S in the system is a dollar sign. The deep state functions with its blood system, and that is money, dollars. Fortunes are made through the deep state. And we'll start at the left here in the blue letters. You've got the military-industrial complex, which most of us know about. Eisenhower, in his speech, originally called this the military-industrial congressional complex because it was so tied into Congress, it was influencing Congress. I will prove that later on in this slide, that it is a serious problem to our constitutional government. Under the deep state, you've got the huge intelligence contractors that are making billions of dollars off intelligence contracts. Below that, you have defense contractors. I'll talk about some of those. The secret Federal Reserve, which is not a federal agency, that is controlling the deep state. It is issuing money to these defense contractors, not telling any of us which major corporations they are actually giving trillions of dollars to, claiming that their budget has to be secret for quote-unquote national security. And it's gotten to the point whenever we hear the government use the word national security, we need to be concerned. That's a red flag because that's their definition of national security, not ours, nor the Constitution's. Down at the bottom, you have the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, deeply connected into the world state. Coming out of the Council on Foreign Relations and beyond, the IMF and World Bank is working towards, along with the deep state, a global economic system. Some would call it a global economic government. That is in the works. They're working on that. More on that later. Some people call it the New World Order. Susan Rice and Barack Obama called it the New International World Order. Whatever you want to call it, the deep state is working towards a global economic system. Now you move over to the right there, and you have military-industrial complex lobbyists. These lobbyists are so influential in the deep state. Saudi Arabia, for example, and Israel, they might as well have a seat in Congress with the power and the money that they wield in congressional decisions outside of the elected system. These foreign lobbyists, Saudi Arabia at the top of that, have tremendous influence on our unelected parts of government and tremendous influence over Congress. And you move to the right, and that would include foreign lobbyists, basically, which I just mentioned. You have the central banks up to the upper right center of the slide there. The central banks connected into the IMF and the World Bank. The central banks are connected to what some people call the oligarchy or the financial elites. You control the purse strings. You control the government, as we've heard often before. And then you have Wall Street, which finances the deep state. It finances the defense contractors, the intelligence contractors. I don't know, most people may not know that many of the big Wall Street firms hide their money in offshore accounts so that Americans, Congress, or anyone else really has no idea of the billions or trillions of dollars that these Wall Street banks have.
And Kevin,
yes,
if
please.
I can just jump in real quick.
Yeah, Joe.
How you just talked about how the funding works. We have been seeing a steady increase in the media losing its ratings. And some people say that if its ratings continue to plummet, they're going to lose advertisers, therefore go out of business. Is the media one of the areas of the deep state that will not run out of money because of who they're funded by?
Well, they're going to have problems with advertisers, but the mainstream media specifically are tied directly into the deep state. They have been since the Council of Foreign Relations, since CIA's program Operation Mockingbird. And by the way, the CIA is still controlling the media. In 1976, the program was changed to being voluntary, and the CIA has all kinds of crafty ways to make things voluntary. So no, kind of like too big to fail, the banks that the government bailed out. We have got major news outlets that are too big to fail. So the major ones are not going away, and many of them are plugged into the deep state. Some of the members in the correspondence are actually tied into the shadow government. I'm convinced that some of them are even still connected to the CIA. So to answer your question, Joe, the major ones I think will stay around despite how their revenues decline. That answer your question, Joe?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, good. All right, let's move on. We're talking about the shadow government. This is the secret, massive secret system inside the government. Now, let's look at the number of installations of people. This is inside the United States. Remember that the CIA and the NSA are supposed to have charters that only function with a mission outside of the United States. That is in their regulations and their charters until 9/11 happened. Now, if you look at this slide at the top, there are 10,000 secret organizations that are operating within the United States. 10,000, so many that not even Congress knows about them all. To the left there's 1,271 major government agencies involved in secrecy inside the United States. You move over to the right there's 1,931 major private corporations involved in secrecy in the United States. More on that later. Down at the bottom, 4,800,000 Americans hold government secrecy, hold government clearances, and have signed the government secrecy agreement. I'll explain why that's important. Down at the bottom, hundreds of thousands of Americans, from secretaries to people in the mailroom to CEOs, have signed contracts with the CIA, the NSA, and some others, but primarily those two. They've signed contracts, and all of them have been required to sign a CIA secrecy agreement. They are now bound by the CIA. People don't realize this. When the CIA offers them a contract and they take it, they are now bound, and the CIA now is in control of them. And most of them, they've got dollar signs in their eyes, and they don't think that one through. So over to the left there, you've got 854,000 Americans that have top secret security clearances with the shadow government. But I want to stress that these figures are the only ones that we know. The 4,800,000 Americans with government clearances, the 854,000 with top secret clearances, those are just what we know. And I can guarantee that the shadow government is quite a bit bigger than that. Now, at the bottom of this slide to the left, you'll see the Secrecy Agreement. The Secrecy Agreement is a confidentiality agreement originally created by the government to protect legitimate sources and methods. For example, satellite technology, important weapons of warfare, troop movements overseas. It was initially created to protect those things from getting out into the public for obvious reasons. It is now has morphed into a weapon used by the shadow government, a weapon of intimidation to silence anyone who sees any program that they think is illegal or unconstitutional. They will have signed this secrecy agreement, which threatens administrative action, termination, or prison if they talk about any activity connected to the shadow government that they're involved in or have been involved in at some time in the past. So they are now bound to keep their mouths shut, and they can, and in 99% of the cases, they will not say anything about what the shadow government is doing for fear of their financial life, prison, or even worse. Down to the bottom right, I'll talk about this in detail. If an American citizen has the courage to push what they have found out about what the shadow government is doing, to push it all the way to the top, if they survive that long, the government, the CIA and the NSA specifically, have the monarchical power to use what is called the state's secrets privilege, and they can shut down any case against them with impunity, no questions asked, without examining any of the evidence, and those cases are sealed forever, so not even Congress or the Senate can see information in that case, including unclassified information. So when you look at this slide, you see at least the tip of the iceberg of the power of the shadow government inside the United States. Next. Now, let's look at this. Everybody's heard of the military-industrial congressional complex. And let's look at why Eisenhower called it the congressional complex. This is the matrix of influence that the military-industrial complex has over Congress. Now, remember, the only voice that we, the people, have in Washington, D.C., in our government, is Congress. So obviously, Congress is the shadow government and the deep state's primary target of control. You control Congress, you control the American people. More on that later. But through the Defense Authorization Act, which is done in secret, there are 48 senior members, congressmen and senators, who meet and vote on the Defense Authorization Act and how much money is going to be given for military-industrial complex contractors for that kind of work. And if you can see, let me start at the left. Lockheed Martin is essentially a private federal government. Let's say a private shadow government. Lockheed Martin has gotten so massive and so huge, it rivals several U.S. government agencies. Lockheed Martin has a program where they track all of our mail through the Postal Service. They're developing the biometrics being used at the airports. Lockheed Martin, in addition to making bombs, missiles, and nuclear warheads, Lockheed Martin is involved in all kinds of classified information outside of just planes, bombs, and missiles, to the extent that they are so funded by Congress. It's been locked in pretty much that each American household pays Lockheed Martin through their taxes about $260 a year for every household in the United States. Lockheed Martin was behind designing information tracking programs for the CIA, behind information collection with the NSA, and on and on and on it goes. I want people to remember Lockheed Martin. It is essentially a para-government. It is a secret government. It is so massive, it rivals the size of several federal agencies. Now, let me move on here, pick it up a little bit. You've got Northrop Grumman. These are the major military and industrial complex firms that are influenced. I picked these because they're the big dogs, the too big to fail companies, private companies, and these are the ones that really are running things in terms of the MIC. You've got Boeing. Now, over to the right, you have the infamous Booz Allen Hamilton. That is where Edward Snowden worked. Booz Allen Hamilton is another massive organization that's been working specifically with the CIA and the shadow government going back about 30 years. They even helped the CIA set up the intelligence apparatus for the government of Egypt. That was Booz Allen and Hamilton. Above that, you've got Raytheon, then you've got General Dynamics. Now, what I want to point out here, all this is done through the votes of the Congressional Armed Services Committee, of which our friend John McCain is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Each one of the members, these 48 senior members and other congressmen and senators, get similar contributions into their re-election campaigns, which is really important to note, and also into their leadership PACs. Each one of these 48 members receive an average each of about $700,000 per year in contributions from these military-industrial contractors. I've got up there the picture of Senator John McCain. In 1 year, John McCain received $694,508 from the military-industrial complex as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. So I would ask the audience this question: is it in John McCain's financial interest to push for foreign wars or covert operations? I would say yes. As a matter of fact, John McCain has been the poster boy of the MIC. You see him on television programs, just about every television program they can get him on. John McCain is on there pushing for war in Syria, and on it goes. Well, now we see the motivation: $698,000 plus a year into his pocket for pushing essentially war, bombs, and missiles. Down at the bottom, you can see that the budget is $1 trillion of annual spending for defense-related purposes. That is a massive budget. And guess who? Guess who is the largest arms dealer in the world? That would be us. The United States, under this budget, spends $46 billion a year in foreign arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia and others. So here you have the military-industrial complex, which functions underneath the deep state. Next. Now, we have something that I uncovered. I call this the secret intelligence industrial complex. Most people don't even know this exists. If you go out there and do some searching, you can find it. It is a massive corporate monopoly that has huge contracts with the CIA, the NSA, the NGA, and the NRO. Now, these the CEOs, both in the military-industrial complex and in the secret intelligence industrial complex, the average salary of the CEOs of these corporations is $2.7 million a year. That's what they make, the CEOs, a year. This is big business for these people. You got Leidos Holdings, a massive company. Now, again, these are the two big to fail intelligence industrial contractors. SAIC, which was part of the NSA program that failed, the surveillance program that Bill Binney came out and talked about, and Thomas Drake came out and talked about. They lost $7 billion of taxpayer money because the program didn't work, and hence Bill Binney and others came out about that. Over to the right there, or excuse me, let's go down to the bottom. Once again, we see our old friend Booz Allen Hamilton popping up again. Billions of dollars in contracts from the intelligence, the secret shadow government, from the intelligence agencies. Booz Allen Hamilton makes a lot of money from this system. Over to the right, you have CACI. They were the ones that ran the torture program for the CIA. And up top, you have the last one, CSRA, which is another billion-dollar corporation. These corporations do up to 80% of the work for the shadow government, the secret complex, are done by these private corporations. This is, if you look at the bottom, $50 billion annual budget in, of course, our tax revenue, which the majority, if not all of us, have no idea that money is being spent for those things. Our vote, there is no vote for what that money is spent on. It is a secret budget. Now, these companies do top secret work, which means everything that they do with this $50 billion budget is top secret. None of it is reported. These are unelected officials that most of us don't know about, which means that they have absolutely no accountability to Congress or the American people. For example, SAIC lost $7 billion through the badly instituted, engineered NSA surveillance program. Essentially, SAIC is still getting government contracts despite losing $7 billion. Next slide, please. Now, you can see why I'm taking some risk here with revealing some of these things, but I've pretty much had enough. People need to know about this. They need to know this is going on. We're in a post-constitutional government, but this is still a republic, a democracy, and the people should be in charge, and they have a right to know. Now, I bring this in because it's so important, especially now with the economy. The shadow government and the deep state, this is their budget, which comes out of IRS taxes. And if you can see this, I hope you can read it. The cost of the shadow government and the deep state. The total intelligence agency budget, as I mentioned, is $50 billion. The total defense budget is $598 billion. The cost of overseas military bases, many of which are no longer needed, is $150 billion. The military aid to foreign countries like Pakistan, who really don't like us very much, our aid to foreign countries is $5.9 billion, and congressional lobbyists on behalf of the military-industrial complex and others cost about $4 billion. That is a total that the shadow government and deep state spend of tax dollars of about $803 billion a year in tax revenue, some of which is done in secret. Now look down at the bottom. Here's the cost to Americans' vital security. Social Security has been robbed, stolen. The money through taxes that Americans have put in there has been taken by Congress and spent to the point where it's in the red. And now they're talking about someday it may go away. That is, people have contributed into that their entire working life, and it has been stolen by Congress. Medicare, they're talking about, well, this is an entitlement program and it's too expensive. We're going to have to defund Medicare. Medicaid, well, same thing. We can't keep these entitlement programs on for too long, so we're going to have to defund and maybe eventually eliminate that. Healthcare, took decades to get a healthcare program in. Shame on Congress for that. And now they're talking about, well, it's too expensive. Anybody that has a pre-existing condition, it's too expensive to cover those, so they're going to have a special plan with higher premiums. So mom and dad who are in their 70s or 80s when they need health insurance the most, they all have pre-existing conditions, which means they're going to be put out there paying higher premiums than most other people, premiums that they can't afford if they're on Social Security and other things. Of course, the economy at the bottom, unemployment is probably close to 20%. If you look at the real figures, there's poverty actually in America. Americans are suffering, and there's poverty in the United States. So if we want to solve these problems, I can tell you where we can take the money from, move up to that $803 billion in tax revenue that the shadow government and deep state are spending without our approval on all their programs, so the CEOs can make $27.1 million a year. Most of their program managers can make $120,000, $160,000 a year for many programs that we no longer need. I would say let's hold Congress accountable to take that money that they're spending without our approval on programs that are no longer necessary and go down here and spend it on some of these things that they say have to be defunded because we don't have the money. It's shameful. Next slide, please. All right, the creation of the CIA. I call the CIA the central node of the shadow government. I'll explain why. I put this in my book, this quote. This is a quote from Harry Truman, who approved the CIA, approved it coming into being. After about 3 to 4 years of the CIA's functioning, Truman made this quote in the Washington Post in an op-ed. There is something about the way the CIA has been functioning that is casting a shadow, interesting word, on our historic position of freedom, and I feel that we need to correct it. That was published in an op-ed in the Washington Post, December 22nd, 1963. 3 days later, the Post mysteriously pulled that from the paper, and it wasn't seen again. Now, remember, Washington Post was connected to CIA's Operation Mockingbird back then, and apparently somebody got to them. I think apparently nothing. Someone got to them. Truman was later to call the CIA a sinister and mysterious agency, of which we're going to see more of. Next slide. All right, shadow government, the CIA, the central node. This is what the CIA has been involved in. They still control, despite what they say, all of the other 17 intelligence branches. They have tremendous power. We've seen them. The power. Let's go back. We just jumped ahead one. There we go. Thank you. They've instituted the torture program. None of us had any say on that. And by the way, it wasn't just waterboarding. It was worse than that. People died. We've got the drone program. I think they've droned to date about 8 wedding parties going after one target. Now they can just target based on behavior, not specific information. They've droned 8 wedding parties. They've engaged in 80 coups overseas, the overturning of democratically elected governments. They've engaged in multiple false flags, false operations. If you go back to Operation Gladio, where they were planning false terrorist cells in Italy and staging terrorist attacks, which killed about 491 people. They've been engaged in things like that. Now, this is what I want to stress. The CIA was created with no congressional approval. That is required by the Constitution. These are unelected officials that are engaging in these things. They manipulate Congress routinely with secrecy. I'll show you that a little bit later. The power that the CIA wields with secrecy, way beyond the Constitution. They have manipulated the judiciary system. I'll talk more about that. They control, through the secrecy agreements and the secret apparatus, the defense and intelligence corporations and their employees, which is a massive number of Americans who are financially dependent on the CIA. They have manipulated the president in political decisions. Remember Iraq, the false intelligence that led us into Iraq, which resulted in the death of 5,000 American troops and about 500,000 Iraqi civilians. And I think when someone asked Donald Rumsfeld, don't you feel bad that 500,000 Iraqis have died? And his response is something to the effect, there was something to the effect of, well, it is what it is. Unbelievable. And of course, the CIA's budget, the central node, engaging in all of these things that most Americans, if not all, would disapprove of. That budget is secret. It is now the biggest budget in the intelligence system, even over and above NSA. That budget is secret with our tax dollars. Most of the congressmen and senators do not know where that budget goes. This comes from tax revenue from the American people. Next slide, please. Now, the creation of the CIA, and I appreciate you rearranging these slides so we don't have the overlap because we're not clicking here. The creation of the shadow government. This is very, very important. The central node. The CIA was created through the National Security Act of 1947. This made the CIA accountable only to the president, Harry Truman, at the time, through the NSC, or National Security Council. And of course, Truman later regretted that. Now, this is what's important. This is the authority that was given to the CIA. This is it right here, all of it. This is what it says. This National Security Act of 1947 allows the CIA to, quote, perform such other functions and duties as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. There is no mention in there for authorization, legal authorization for covert operations. None. It's not there. There's no definition in there for what the CIA's role actually is. and there are no restrictions placed on the CIA either, and we can see where that one went. So there is no democratic or congressional oversight over the CIA's creation, nor over its current operations today. This is a serious constitutional loophole of unchecked secrecy and unchecked covert operations, and people need to understand that this is a serious violation of the Constitution, and we can see where it's left us today, and we can see the number of things, including pretty serious human rights violations that have occurred through these so-called covert operations. Next slide, please. Now, we talk about the Cold War, and will the Cold War come back again? Is the Cold War coming back with Russia? It's important to note that there is an internal Cold War within our government between the elected government and the shadow government. People need to understand. You can see that right now with Donald Trump in Washington. More on that later. Regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, Donald Trump has got the shadow government terrified because he has claimed he's going to investigate and maybe revamp it, and they know that his personality is just enough that he would probably carry through on that. But let's look at this. The shadow government against the elected government. It is a huge complex of secrecy, surveillance, and covert programs. It is the size of 23 U.S. Capitol buildings. It's the size of 3 Pentagons. And we can see something that it engaged in which is shocking. If you and your audience remember, John Brennan and the CIA broke into the Senate computers on Capitol Hill and spied on what Dianne Feinstein and the committee was doing, spied on them to see what they were investigating and writing up for the CIA torture report. Literally broke into Senate computers on Capitol Hill and surveilled what they were writing in the torture report. That is a felony. It is breaking the law. John Brennan was behind that. He was responsible for that. I always ask the question, was Mr. Brennan indicted for that? Was anybody held accountable for that? No, he issued an apology, quote unquote, just an apology. But this is the chilling part. They came out and they asked Barack Obama, what do you think about John Brennan and the CIA hacking into the Senate? And Barack Obama's response to that was pretty telling. Well, I have full confidence in Director Brennan's abilities. The reason that President Obama said that, and this is the chilling part, it's because President Obama could do nothing about what the CIA was doing. He couldn't stop it. Brennan and the CIA did this unilaterally, and not even the President of the United States could do anything about it. And that's something that we need to remember because that's extremely important. Okay, next slide, please. Now, along comes Donald Trump, who challenges the shadow government all the way back to JFK, demanding that the assassination of JFK be looked into. And I understand that the classified files on the JFK assassination are due to be released upon presidential approval. I think it's this October. So a lot of these folks are terrified that Donald Trump is going to approve the JFK assassination classified reports, approve them being opened up to the public, which they should have been in the beginning, but being opened up this October. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, whether you think he's a great patriot, whether you think he's a fascist, which I think is farthest from the truth, on and on and on, there's no doubt about the fact that Donald Trump will no doubt examine some of these agencies and what they've done. That's why they are essentially engaging in a de facto, right now it's a character assassination, an information assassination, and let's just hope and pray to God it doesn't go further than that. This is what Senator Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said about this on the Rachel Maddow show in public. If you cross the intelligence community, the CIA, NSA, have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. Now just think about that for a moment. If you cross the shadow government has 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you, and he's talking about the President of the United States. I think we have a constitutional crisis here. Next slide, please. So, shadow government system of secrecy. Let's go into and we moved the logo over a little bit, but that's fine. The National Security Agency is the eyes and ears of the shadow government, as we all painfully know. Up there in the right-hand corner is a picture of the original NSA. It was called the Black Chamber. That's basically the size when it just started out during the war. As we also know, the National Security Agency is a massive system of global surveillance, domestic surveillance on we as U.S. citizens. Now, under the Freedom Act, we are told that the NSA domestic surveillance program has been reformed. And I like what Ron Paul said about this. Whenever the government says it's reforming something, we need to be, that's a heads up. We need to be alarmed. They usually reform it in the wrong direction. The surveillance continues. And if you remember the 1.5 billion bits of information that the NSA had scooped up on all of us as Americans, our emails, our texting, our cell phone conversations, electronic pocket litter, on and on and on. With this reform, that information didn't go away. They didn't go in and erase all that information from the Utah data center. That information on all of us still resides on those computers. It's still there. It wasn't removed. And also, the NSA can still go in and surveil American citizens by simply asking for approval from Verizon, for example. The big change was Verizon now has to give the NSA approval to come in and do that instead of the NSA just breaking into their computers without them knowing about it. So now the NSA has to ask approval to do this same surveillance. And the question is, what Silicon Valley company is going to turn them down? There is so much information on us, the American people, that's stored up until this reform that they have to classify it in a new term that's called yottabytes. That is what is stored on the Utah data center on the NSA storage system on what they've collected on American citizens. Yottabytes, the amount of information there would equal filling the states of Delaware and Rhode Island with bits and bytes. That's how much information is on those things. It takes cooling systems the size of a warehouse just to cool off these computers. So we know that NSA has been given exclusive authority to collect and unmask Americans, as we saw with what was going on with the Trump campaign pre and post-election. The NSA and the U.S. government has created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA Court, which is a new secret Supreme Court that will decide and decides what Americans are going to be surveilled on, whose names are going to be unmasked and revealed. This is a secret court that the Congress and the Senate don't have access to. They don't see. They have nothing to do with these decisions. And of course, we, the American people, are just stuck out of that picture. I want to state here again at the bottom that the CIA and the NSA are shielded by the state secrets privilege. There have been lawsuits regarding the NSA's collecting data on American citizens. Those lawsuits have been shut down with impunity by, guess what? The state secrets privilege, sealed, and not even Congress or Senate will ever see that information. It'll never see the light of day. Next slide, please. Excuse me for a sec. Okay, now, I want to stress this. The shadow government, the secret government, and Congress. Remember, I stress that Congress is the people's only voice. The only voice that the American people have in our elected government system, designed intentionally by the Founding Fathers, should be the primary voice, and that is Congress, the United States Congress. Now, Congress has the legal authority to control the CIA through its budget. One problem. The CIA, which is its MO, the CIA classifies and withholds the documents necessary for Congress to do that. It paralyzes Congress through classifying and blacking out the documents, so Congress doesn't even know what it has oversight over and doesn't even know what needs to be cut back. That's how they do it. That's their modus operandi. I'll talk more about that later. Excuse me. And they say we have congressional oversight. There's the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, HPSI and SSCI. Well, we've got oversight bodies over the CIA and the NSA. No, forgive me, but that is a sham. Most of the HPSI and the SSCI are staffed by just a handful of staffers. They're inexperienced in intelligence operations. There's a high turnover, and I've heard of cases when I was on the inside of big folders of information that were supposed to be reviewed by the oversight committees that were just thrown in the closet, and the closet was locked and no investigation was done whatsoever. And remember, for any congressman or senator to really dig deep into the CIA could mean complete professional and career destruction, and probably would. So they're not going to go there. Next one down in the blue, military and industrial complex. The intelligence lobbyists, as I showed you in the previous slide, control congressmen and senators. They are controlling the only body that represents the American people. And many of us know there's a revolving door from Congress to the military-industrial complex. A congressman, after a certain period of time, a year or so, can go out into the military-industrial complex and make millions of dollars as a consultant. We know that James Comey, when he did his stint with Lockheed Martin, as it was a contributor to the Clinton Foundation, James Comey made $6 million in 1 year for sitting on their board. So these congressmen and senators know not to mess with these companies. Many of them know they're going to get big paychecks when they leave. That also applies to congressional staffers. Congress is now sadly composed of statesmen. What I mean by that is they have no intention of changing how the state, the federal government is operating. They have no intention, with a couple of exceptions. I happen to be a somewhat of a fan of Rand Paul, but with a couple of exceptions, most congressmen and senators have no intention of changing the way things are in the federal government. They're statesmen. They make a lot of money through their jobs. They don't want to change anything. They have no intention of correcting some of these constitutional violations. They're not constitutionalists. They're now statesmen. Next slide, please. Now, okay, well, and this, I want to address this too, the deep state, as everyone is calling it now. The deep state is basically just holdovers from the Obama administration. There are plants in there that are trying to destroy Donald Trump. And these are all people have placed there by Obama to get Donald Trump later on. Well, certainly there are holdovers from the Obama administration in there, but I want to stress the shadow government is not a bunch of holdovers from the previous Obama administration. We have to understand the shadow government has been there. It's been operating. It's been controlling Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary. It has been controlling that since about 1948. We lost our Constitution in 1948. For example, the Clinton administration and the Bush Sr., both when Clinton was governor, Bush was president, engaged in the Iran-Contra scandal, broke the law behind Congress, broke U.S. law, broke international law, and engaged in drug running. Then you had George W. Bush, Iraq, NSA surveillance, CIA torture, secret prisons, the FBI warrantless searches. Then you had Barack Obama, prosecuted more leakers than any president in history, expanded the NSA surveillance program, expanded the drone program, and had us going into Syria, supporting the so-called moderate Free Syrian Army, many of which have morphed into ISIS. Then you had Hillary Clinton, connected directly to Saudi Arabia with the Clinton Foundation, huge contributions from Wall Street for her speeches and the military-industrial complex, involved in the toppling of the Libya government, and the essential de facto assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, who had pleaded with the U.S. To be sent to asylum if the U.S. wanted him gone. They chose instead just to set it up for him to be killed. Secretary of State Clinton was secretly running guns to the Syrian rebels using Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which I mentioned before. Those weapons wound up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and ultimately in the hands of ISIS. Then you have Congress, and this is sad. Congress will promise their voters, their constituents back in their states, that they're going to go to Washington and they're going to make a change. They're going to help them get out of their serious economic crisis. They're going to help restore all these problems with the Constitution. But when they get there, look at their voting records. They support shadow government, deep state wars. Some of these secret operations where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are killed, citizens. And it was Congress that approved the government surveillance program. That's what I mean by statesmen. They promise their constituents one thing, then they vote for the shadow government behind the scenes. Next slide, please. Let's look at some of the shadow government's constitutional violations. Remember, I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk that if any government official violates the Constitution, that is a felony. They are breaking the law. So I want you to remember that as we go through these constitutional violations that the shadow government, that the government and the deep state have done. They have control over congressional hearings, withholding information, documents, and testimony by blacking it out. Under the MK Ultra program, where the CIA was engaging in drug testing on unwitting people, the CIA destroyed most of those documents, so Congress couldn't even see what was being done. The same thing happened with Operation Mockingbird, documents destroyed, and we saw with the torture program, the videotapes of tortures were also destroyed, and they got away with all of it. Blocking Congress from covert programs, engaging in covert programs that Congress doesn't even know about. That's a violation of the Constitution. classifying and concealing illegal operations, like the Iran-Contra affair, for example, a felony. Establishing covert funding from illegal activity, going back to Operation Gladio. I'd recommend a book called The Unholy Alliance by Paul Williams, where he documents with 2,000 footnotes that the CIA was essentially running drugs to obtain money for its covert funding and running that money, laundering it through the secret Vatican bank, which keeps no records. We know that the deep state, especially the shadow government, has surveilled Congress. The NSA surveilled Congress's discussions with Israel about the Iran nuclear program. I've just demonstrated that John Brennan and the CIA broke into Senate computers. These are felonies. Was anyone prosecuted? Was anyone indicted? No, no one. Control of the judiciary with the secret FISA court and the unbelievable, abominable use of the state secrets privilege, which is the same power as a king. I thought we were supposed to get away from the rulership of a king. Secret use of the Americans' tax dollars for secret budgets, for all of this stuff. Secret budgets with absolutely no approval by the taxpayer or the voter, which I've talked about. Domestic massive surveillance of U.S. citizens, 1.5 billion bits of information a day, and one after another. Government officials lying under oath. The DNI lied under oath about the NSA program. The CIA has done it multiple times with impunity. The NSA has lied under oath, and the FBI lied under oath. Director Mueller lied under oath about the number of times that the FBI had broken into Americans' homes without a warrant. Sadly, it continues. Next slide. More constitutional violations, felonies, secret operations involving human rights violations. In Chile, the Augusto Pinochet regime, the CIA paid and supported Pinochet's forces, which killed, they killed 40,000, executed 40,000 civilians, and 200,000 other civilians disappeared. That was supported by the CIA. Silencing whistleblowers, which we've seen, elimination of the right to trial. Most people, intelligence officers, don't realize they have no right to trial when they sign up with the shadow government. Secret prisons, rendition, and torture. If you go all the way back to the original creation of the CIA with Allen Dulles, guess what Allen Dulles was involved in? Secret prisons, rendition, and torture. The organization hasn't changed a bit. The National Defense Authorization Act, which includes, as most of us know, the indefinite detention of American citizens without habeas corpus. Boom, just lock them up with no constitutional rights whatsoever. FBI national security letters, we know about that, where the FBI can go into someone's employer, demand all their information, and then advise that supervisor if they tell the employee they're going to prison for doing so. Warrantless searches that the FBI has engaged in. The drone assassination program, we know now that the president has a presidential kill list where he decides who's going to get droned out. And as I mentioned, they've hit several. They call it collateral damage, a shameful term. But we've seen that they've hit, in counting, eight wedding parties, bombed entire cafes going after one person, killing, I think in that case, 34 innocent people. And then we have 9/11. That's a whole nother lecture. But 9/11 has us in a continual state of emergency. Remember the war on terror? War will place the United States in a state of emergency, overriding the U.S. Constitution, meaning the government can supersede the Constitution at any time. We are still in that continual state of emergency, and Barack Obama reinstituted and extended that state of emergency. We'll see what Donald Trump will do. Ladies and gentlemen, these are felonies. These are violations of the U.S. Constitution by government officials and government agencies, and I just want to drive that point home. Next slide, please. Now, the shadow government, they'll reward the faithful. If you just keep your mouth shut and you engage in these unconstitutional things, as we have seen, you won't be indicted, you won't be prosecuted. In many cases, you'll be rewarded. Here we have George W. Bush, President George W. Bush, awarding the Presidential Medal of Freedom to CIA Director George Tenet. George Tenet, who provided falsified intelligence leading to the Iraq War, the death of 500,000 Iraqi civilians, 5,000 U.S. troops, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 U.S. troops injured or suffering from PTSD, with a suicide rate, I think, of 6 per day or something like that. So he provided falsified intelligence leading to the Iraq War. He withheld critical information prior to the 9/11 attack, and the CIA was the only federal agency that refused to provide any information to the 9/11 Commission. They wouldn't give them a thing. They wouldn't let them see a thing. And of course, George Tenet presided over and supervised, managed the torture program, renditions, and secret prisons. And what does he get? He gets a medal for doing it. George Tenet also invoked the state's secrets privilege, the power of a monarchy, to seal cases against him in cases like this more than any other CIA director in history. Now, during the whole time that Director Tenet was involved in these things, guess who was his chief of staff? Chief of staff was none other than John Brennan. John Brennan was later rewarded and appointed as director of, guess what? The CIA. And John Brennan, being rewarded, continued the torture program, the drone program, expanded the drone program, spied on the Senate, and John Brennan continued to invoke the state's secrets privilege to seal cases against the CIA. So the shadow government rewards itself. Next slide, please. Excuse me. I call this, humbly, in my book, the tyranny of secrecy. Secrecy is now used to subvert the U.S. Constitution. It is an incredible power that the shadow government has to completely circumvent Congress, circumvent the Constitution, manipulate the President of the United States, and manipulate the judiciary. This is tyranny. Next slide, please. We all remember this. John F. Kennedy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. And later on he said, I will splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. John F. Kennedy's major enemy was then CIA Director John Dulles. John Dulles was engaged in multiple human rights violations, torture, rendition, experiments on human beings, and on and on and on it went. That's another lecture. He was the arch enemy of John F. Kennedy. After John F. Kennedy fired Alan Dulles, which was the only biggest black mark on Dulles' entire career, which he resented the rest of his life. And after Dulles was fired, he got together and organized a group of former senior CIA officers, managers, to work against Kennedy's policies and try to subvert his policies. As we know, John F. Kennedy was eventually assassinated, and guess who they put in charge of the Warren Commission investigating the assassination? Alan Dulles. They put Alan Dulles in charge of the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The Fox investigating the hen house. We'll just leave that one right there. Let's move on. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, I'll have to, the slide's being rearranged a little bit, but good. These slides had transitions where the words moved around and things, and we just couldn't do that here, so I apologize to the audience. But here's where it all started. The government legalized lying to the American people, called the state's secrets privilege. I want everybody to remember that. There was an Air Force B-29 bomber, 1948, crashed in Waycross, Georgia. I've been to the site. I've got photographs of the site in my book. 3 RCA civilian engineers were killed in that crash. Their widows asked the Air Force in this classified program connected to the shadow government what caused the crash, what caused their husbands to die. The Air Force came back and said, well, we can't tell you what caused the crash because it's classified. Same old, same old. We're seeing that today. The widows took the Air Force to court, demanded to know what caused the crash of this bomber, and that is when the shadow government, the Air Force, the CIA, created the state's secrets privilege, derived it directly from the monarchy, the King of England, put it into place, and invoked the state's secrets privilege to shut down the widow's case and seal it forever. Incredibly, that crash report of that Air Force B-29 bomber was found, guess where? On the internet, completely unclassified, and it showed gross negligence on the part of the pilots that drove that B-29 right into the ground in that farm. So the whole thing was a lie. It wasn't classified. The crash report was unclassified, but it did show severe negligence on part of the U.S. Air Force. That was used to create the state's secrets privilege. As I mentioned, the state secrets privilege is now used by the CIA and the NSA to seal any cases against them forever, so not even Congress or Senate has access to the information. So the point is, the state secrets privilege, the most tyrannical power in the U.S. government, was based on a lie by the government, and it's now treated as tyrannical law. Next slide, please. Shadow government, tyranny of secrecy. The shadow government, specifically the CIA, has control over Congress. I want you all to see this because this is the shadow government manipulating and controlling our elected government. Control over the Congress, manipulating congressional hearings, withholding clearances from congressmen and senators. If they don't want a congressman or senator to know what they're doing, they just withhold the clearance. You can't see any of the information if you have the clearance that only the CIA can give you. They classify documents to conceal their illegal activity, so Congress can't even see what's in the documents. I'll show you some of those later. And they block Congress, as I mentioned, using the state secrets privilege. How do they control the White House? They blindfold the president. They've engaged in operations the president was not even aware of, perhaps sometimes intentionally. They've manipulated the president. Example is the false intelligence that led to the Iraq War, as I mentioned. And they influenced the president's reelection. As the quote from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer indicated, the shadow government can influence a president's reelection. You better play by our rules, or we're going to work against you, and we're going to ensure that you're not reelected. In the case of Donald Trump, from John Brennan to Director Clapper to Mike, Assistant Acting Director of the CIA, Mike Morrell, and on and on and on down through the shadow government leaders, they have all come out against Donald Trump and worked with the Russiagate narrative to try to remove him from office. This is the shadow government trying to remove an elected president, elected by the majority of the people through the democratic electoral process and the electoral college. And the shadow government is trying to remove this president through things like the false dossier that one John McCain got from a source paid for by the Democratic Party, and then leaked that to John Brennan, who then leaked it to the press as if it was intelligence. This is heinous. I did 20 years of work in the CIA and then with the Department of State. I have never, ever seen this happen with any president before. But then again, there's never been a president who stated that he was going to look into the JFK assassination, 9/11, and other things. This is unprecedented. Control of the judiciary. I mentioned the secret FISA court, which is a new secret Supreme Court, and the use of the state's secrets privilege, coercing judges to rubber stamp these cases. Next slide, please. Tyranny of secrecy. The CIA, if you want to conceal it, just classify it. I'll give you some examples. Congress demanded the torture report, that the CIA release what they were engaged in torture. If you look above Darrell Issa there, you can see what the CIA provided. This is the torture report information that the CIA provided to Congress. See any problems there? You can't even read it. It's totally blacked out. Now, if you look down at Congressman Issa, when Congress, in investigation, demanded the information on Fast and Furious, running guns to drug cartels across the border, this is, you can see Mr. Issa holding up, this is the document that they released to Congress for their examination. Can you see a problem with that? Now, the 9/11 report is supposed to be transparent, so the American people, in your upper right-hand corner, so the American people could know what happened in 9/11, and frankly, we don't in a large way because a criminal investigation was never done. If one is done, you get an entirely different picture. But 28 pages of the so-called transparent 9/11 report, you can see it right there. They've been blacked out. George W. Bush ordered that that information in there be blacked out. Indications are that was Saudi Arabia's connection to 9/11. Saudi Arabia is tied at the hip with the CIA and our intelligence services, and most conjectures I've seen by some of the congressmen involved, they think that's what that was. So this is how they do it. This is the modus operandi. If the CIA wants to conceal something from Congress, Congress demands through their power of the oversight committees, they demand information. Well, you can see what they get. They get documents blacked out. Nobody can stop them. Nobody challenges them because they know they don't have the authority to stop the CIA, and no one can come back and demand that they take the blackouts off this stuff. This is ultimate power that the CIA has. It is absolute tyranny. Next slide. So the big question is, we hear all the time, if this is going on, if the shadow government and these agencies are violating the Constitution in such a large capacity, why is no one speaking out against it? Why is no one coming out and quote unquote blowing the whistle? And what they're trying to convey is, well, if no one's coming out against it, then it must not exist. Well, I'm going to show you why no one is coming out against it. There is a complex, organized, well thought out, instituted program that's been there since 1950 to silence anybody who even dares come out and reveal some of these programs. Let's get into that a little bit. I have been in this system. I come from the belly of the beast. I've seen it used. They try to use it on me. So let's get into that. Next slide, please. Shadow government's war on whistleblowers. Yeah, we're going to have to, Eric, if you can bring up the sub bullets. If not, I'll have to talk to it. Looks like it's not coming up. Yeah, if you can jump back one. All right, go back to the slide if you can. Let's just talk about, I'll just talk to this. The shadow government war on whistleblowers. It has a well-refined, perfected system to shut up whistleblowers who try to reveal any of this information. There is a system of personal destruction, and I'll go into that in detail here in a moment, that will destroy the person before they even come out and try to get to the Congress or Senate. If you remember, the 2012 Congress passed the 2012 Whistleblower Protection Act, claiming that whistleblowers in the government are now protected. Well, if you read, most people don't read down in that act. They find out if you read down that any employee that has access to any classified government information, including confidential or sensitive, any employee that has access to classified information, CIA information, is not covered by the 2012 Whistleblower Protection Act. Then Obama went further as a reform, and again, whenever that word is used, you got to watch it. Obama came out with the 2014 Whistleblower Enhancement Protection Act, claiming that intelligence employees now have the protected ability to blow the whistle if they see something go on within the intelligence agency. If you read down on that one, you find out this, that the only way that an intelligence employee can blow the whistle is if they are actually still sitting in that position, still working on the case that they're blowing the whistle on inside that organization, which means they are right in there in the personal system of destruction, right where they want them, right where they can silence them. And that was intentionally put in this 2014 Enhancement Protection Act. So that's no protection of whistleblowers whatsoever. And of course, if the employee takes the case far and is successful, bypassing all of that, they'll simply invoke the state secrets privilege, shut the case down, and threaten that employee with prison if he talks about that case to anyone. Okay, next slide. All right, now I put this in there. How does he know? How do I know what I'm talking about? And I put some of this in the book for two reasons. Number one, so the CIA could not say I never worked there, which they tried to do. And number two, to silence anyone, trolls or other, who would come out and say, oh, this guy never worked for the CIA. Well, I actually, through the Freedom of Information Act, got my CIA performance appraisals in the book to clear that one up. But just so you know, this is not out of any ego. I just want people to know that I've been there. I come from there. I know what I'm talking about. I was a branch chief and a CIA manager. I was an internal counterintelligence investigator, as Doug mentioned. I was an internal staff security investigator, polygraph examiner. I did overseas counterterrorism operations. I was a military industrial complex program manager at the senior level, and I personally stood against the CIA for 12 years. And I placed this evidence in from the Company of Shadows, not to make myself look like a tough guy, but to prove who I was and to prove where I came from, because the media is replete with frauds out there. People who say that they work for the CIA that never did, so-called experts on terrorists that are not experts at all. So when somebody says something, check out their credentials. Anyway, I put this in there just to make it clear that I was indeed involved in this, and I know what I'm talking about. Next slide. All right, in my case, now all these words are supposed to come in layers, no problem. We can work through that. Targeting whistleblowers, my personal experience, and what I saw when I fought the CIA. And most people know it's in the book. I uncovered a vulnerability in CIA systems where a foreign intelligence officer could locate the identities of our agents in the field, which could result in assassination. I presented that investigation to the high levels of the agency. I was threatened. My documents were destroyed 3 times, removed from the server, My career was threatened for doing so. Most people cannot figure out why in the world they would do that unless they wanted to get rid of some of these people. That's pure conjecture. Anyway, I filed suit against the agency. The first thing that was done is I was placed under a gag order, and was my wife and children. The thing about the gag order was I was told it was too sensitive to read. They held on to it for 2 years, claiming it was too sensitive, and I couldn't read it. So I didn't even know what I was gagged by. In other words, I didn't know what I could say and what I couldn't. After 2 years of fighting to get this gag order, you can see down there, this is the gag order that they provided. Does that look familiar? Does that match the MO of documents provided that I just showed you a few slides before? This was a clear case of entrapment. Gag somebody and then refuse to show them what they're gagged by, and then when they say something that's in the gag order, you can come and get them. It was set up. It was entrapment. Thank God I never fell into it. I still have to watch everything I say, but this shows you what the shadow government does to silence whistleblowers. Next slide, please. Okay, this is we've already gone through this. But, the sad part is, where are the whistleblowers? If you go down to the bottom, in blue it says news media compliance. A lot of whistleblowers have made the mistake, myself included, of saying, well, I'll go to the fourth branch of government, the press, and I'll let the press know, and in a free society, this is the way to do it. Nope, not so. I had several publishers turn down my book. The way they stated it was they didn't want to cross the CIA. They didn't even want to see the proposal or their manuscript. When I did reveal my case, and I was very careful to make sure it was all unclassified because I knew they were gunning for me personally, when I did call the Washington Post and gave them my story, what the Washington Post did was immediately call the CIA, report to the CIA that I had just made contact, and tell the CIA what I had just told them. And they sat on it for 30 days until the CIA told them what they could print in their paper. So is there an objective news media? No, there's not. Is the news media, specifically the CIA, specifically the Washington Post, manipulated by the CIA? Yes, it is. Next slide. All right, the shadow government. Let's get into this system of elimination. I want everybody to see this. This is why whistleblowers do not come out. Only a few do, like Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden knew that if he went through the system, he would be destroyed. And he used Thomas Drake, NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake, as his example. Thomas Drake went through the system. They arrested him, tried to convict him of espionage, searched his house, tried to put him in jail for going through the system. So this is their modus operandi. First, they will screen and appoint supervisors that they know will comply with this system of personal destruction. I was a manager, a branch chief. When I was appointed, I was taken into the supervisor's office and ordered to rate down 2 of my employees that worked directly under me, just to let them know not to mess with the system. Now, these 2 employees were top performers. They were both good guys, so I rated them with top ratings on their performance appraisals. I was taken in there and told that a memo was going to be placed in my file that was going to ruin my career, and on it went. So they were testing me to see if I'd comply with this system, which I did not. Next, the supervisor will give veiled threats of retribution. John, if you carry this complaint further, other employees that have done that, well, they've lost their careers. They'll do things like that. Then the employee is denied promotions. And let me stop here. And there are people out there listening to this right now that have worked for the shadow government or the deep state. And I can tell you, I know what you're thinking. You have been through this exact program. And the reason is this is the system that they use every time. It's been used for thousands of people. The employee is denied a promotion, and then they're assigned away from their peers, communicating to the employee that you better not go any further, and communicating to their peers that look what happens if anybody rocks the boat. Then reporting documents, if they do send some of these reporting documents up to higher levels, even the IG, the investigations group, those documents, as in my case when I uncovered this vulnerability, those documents are lost from the internal system. If it's a grievance, if it's documentation of any illegal activity, they are lost. They're removed from the system. Seen it personally. Now, if the employee files a grievance with their investigations group or their IG, IGs are supposed to be impartial. That's not always the case. I've seen that personally. Many IGs are staffed by employees with that organization. I was given false names, and on and on and on it went. And sometimes these IGs are complicit with the organization itself. These are careerists with that organization. And of course, they're not going to control the organization that holds their retirement. Next slide, please. All right. Now, let me read through this. Let's say that the employee has the guts to file a legal suit, in this case against the CIA. What the CIA will do is block any outside attorneys. Any attorney that employee wants to use, the CIA will block it and advise that employee that they can only use a quote-unquote CIA-approved attorney. Now, how do you think that one works out? Next, the CIA demands all evidence that the employee and his or her attorneys have in the case. Any evidence that the employee has, which is the basis of his or her suit, the agency demands that they turn that evidence over, or they have committed a national security violation and face legal consequences. Next, the CIA will hold and control all the documents, including notes from the plaintiff's attorneys, any meetings that the plaintiff has, and as I mentioned, any other evidence. They will hold all those documents and demand that all of that information be held at CIA headquarters in a CIA file in a combination safe. So all of the evidence that the plaintiff, the employee, and his or her attorneys have got to be turned over to the CIA, or they've committed a national security violation. Next, the CIA will classify even unclassified information. Once they classify it, they control it under the classification system. So they'll classify, for example, doctor's diagnosis, environmental reports, things like that. They will classify those, black them out, and store them and control them in CIA headquarters. They will, and this is their favorite, they will intentionally delay the case for years. There have been cases where employees have sued the CIA and they've been delayed up to 8, 9, 10 years. And that is intentional. It wears the employee out. It drains them financially. It drains their attorneys. They wind up bankrupt, and many of them just give up as broken people. If the employee has got the nerve to push it even farther, then, as I mentioned, the CIA and the NSA will invoke what's called the state secrets privilege, seal all the evidence in that case, then threaten the employee if they talk to anyone further, including their attorneys, they will go to prison, which blocks the employee's congressmen and senators from having any access to any of that person's information. In my case, I went to a very good, noble Congressman Frank Wolf, who was an awesome guy, took my case, tried to contact the CIA 7 times. They ignored his calls completely and finally called back and said basically there was nothing he could do. It was none of his business, and they blocked him from the case entirely. Constitutional problem there? You bet there is. And then, of course, if the agency or the NSA, CIA invokes the state secrets privilege, they will threaten the employee, and in some cases their family, with prison if they talk about their case to anyone. Most people will stop right here because they're looking at complete personal destruction. Next slide. Let's go on to more. If they keep going, they will search the employee. This is a favorite one. They'll search the employee's travel accounting, government credit card use for any errors, try to find any mistake the employee has made, and almost everybody makes a mistake somewhere in their travel accounting. They'll look for that, and if they find it, they'll use it against the employee to attack the employee, try to get them to drop their case. Some agencies will deceive the employee because this is a very stressful process. I know I did counterintelligence investigations. They'll deceive the employee into reporting to the medical office because they know they're going through a lot of stress, and this will help them handle their stress. So they go in there, they go through the interview. What is placed in their file is that they're disgruntled or paranoid. That's placed on the record to use later if the agency, NSA, CIA, has to defend itself if it gets that far. Then if that doesn't work, the next step, they'll accuse the employee of trumped-up security violations and brand the employee as a security threat. That is the guise to allow them to conduct surveillance and harassment of the employee. I've seen them break into an employee's house who was completely innocent. I've seen them put bugs on their computer. I've seen them do several things which were illegal and a felony just to harass the employee and try to get them to drop the case. This is a refined system, as I mentioned. They've used it thousands of times. Next slide. So let me try to read through this. What these agencies will do in the shadow government, they'll begin to destroy the employee and their family. If you remember, you can go after most men or women and try to get them to shut up, and many times they will do that. If they don't shut up, if they have the nerve to continue, guess who they go for next? Their family. Everybody knows from the mafia on down, and this is mafia-like stuff, everybody knows that if you target somebody's family, that's how you're going to get to them. I've seen them raise the interest rates on the internal credit union loans of a family, making them impossible to pay because the payments were so high. I've seen them, in my case, they blocked my retirement funds, withheld them, would not release my retirement funds. I called the Office of Personnel Management. That is a felony. Once I told the OPM it was a felony, I had my retirement in a week. This is what they do. They'll drive the employee and their family into financial ruin, into bankruptcy, either through attorney fees, medical bills, on and on, losing their retirement, and on it goes in a system of complete personal destruction. Now, many times the employee is broken and retreats. They give up. They can't stand it anymore. Their finances are ruined. Their family are ruined, is ruined. They don't think there's any way out, and they will drop it. In most cases, they'll stop right there. If they continue, the personal destruction, the system continues. Many of these employees, and there have been cases where the stress is so severe, their family has broken up, they've gone into bankruptcy, they've lost everything. The agency has called and blackballed them with any other private or government agency or corporation out there, prevented them, blacklisted them from getting another job. So they're completely jobless. Sometimes it gets so bad that these employees commit suicide. And if you remember the case of Gary Webb, they did exactly that to Gary Webb. They ruined his family. They ruined his career. They drove him into serious financial bills. He lost his career with the paper. He was driven to a minor, know-nothing job. And then Gary Webb wound up what they claimed was a suicide. Gary Webb had 2 bullets in his head. Now, I don't know how you commit suicide with 2 bullets, but that was the what I call the perfect crime. They silenced Gary Webb. At that point, the system of personal destruction is complete. The employee is no longer a threat, and they will drive them to suicide or other forms of death. If that's what they have to do, they will do it. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of some legal whistleblowers. This is the price of freedom. William Binney exposed the NSA surveillance program. His house was raided by FBI SWAT team members. He was held at gunpoint, a gun to his head. Thomas Drake went through proper channels, exposed the NSA surveillance program. His house was raided by an FBI SWAT team. He was arrested and charged with espionage. He beat it, got off with a misdemeanor. Thank God. This was the case that Edward Snowden used. The example that Edward Snowden used as to why he didn't go through the system was because of what they did to Thomas Drake. This is what you call blowback. Sometimes a shadow government is not real bright. They don't realize that the blowback from what they're doing is worse than if they just did the right thing. Kirk Wiebe exposed, along with Bill Binney, exposed the NSA surveillance program. His house was raided by an FBI SWAT team. John Kiriakou exposed the CIA torture program. John was arrested, sentenced to 30 months in prison. They got it down. He served 2 years in prison. John Kiriakou is not a criminal. He was a senior CIA officer, a top performer. He exposed the CIA torture program, and look what happened. They put him in jail for 2 years, a professional man in jail for 2 years. Next slide, please. What did I do? Well, they blacked out things in my book from the Company of Shadows, things that were not classified, that dealt with the cover-up, that dealt with the break-ins, that dealt with serious illness. My wife came running in one day. Her gums were bleeding. She was bruised all over her body. She lost her short-term memory. They had her on morphine. We were being exposed to a pretty serious poison in the house. Anything related to that was blacked out in my book. I went into operations, how we recruit agents, the vulnerability that I uncovered. They left all that in there, but they blacked out anything relating to the cover-up. According to an executive order, that is illegal. That is a felony. It is against the law for the CIA to black out information in the book just because it reveals illegal activity on the part of the CIA or it's embarrassing. So what I did is I built a code from the Company of Shadows that exposes those illegal blackouts, and I published the book. That's how I dealt with all this. I believe the pen is mightier than the sword, and I wrote that book simply to get the truth out and simply as a way to reveal the unconstitutional, illegal, and horrific things these agencies will do to people. Next slide, please. What can Americans do? I get this after my lectures all the time. Obviously, What can Americans do? The shadow government, just like cockroaches, I have a picture of cockroaches there. The shadow government hates the light. And what Americans need to do is start a grassroots civil movement across America, establish thousands of groups that are unified around the Constitution, and mainly this, cause a social media storm. Get together with programs like Hagmann and Hagmann, InfoWars, and others, and cause a social media storm exposing these things. Next, as far as Congress and the Senate goes, fire them all. These are statesmen, stateswomen now. They have no more intention of reestablishing or supporting the Constitution than the man or woman in the moon. Fire them all and elect congressmen and senators who are constitutionalists. We at least still have some power. Let's use it as best we can. And at the bottom, demand total intelligence agency reform. I am calling for reform of the CIA. I'm calling for the CIA to be investigated, perhaps even dismantled, and return to Truman's original vision of just being an organization that provides real-time intelligence to support the President of the United States and eliminate its power of secrecy and eliminate its power of covert operations. Next slide, please. We must never forget these things as I wrap it up. This is government by the people. The Congress and the Senate are your representatives. A constitutional government serves the people, not the other way around. And remember this, government violations of the Constitution are a felony. They're using your tax dollars to do this for these covert secret budgets, for the shadow government, and for the deep state. And remember, the weapon of tyranny is one thing. This is their currency, fear. The weapon of tyranny of any tyrannical government down through history, and the one we have now, the weapon of tyranny simply is fear. Fight back. Next slide. And I like to leave people with this quote because it's so true, and I think it gives strength to people that hear it. Thomas Jefferson, attributed to Thomas Jefferson, it goes like this. When people fear their government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. Next slide, please. And that's it, you all. That is the lecture. I've come out and I'm saying this because I think the time has come for Americans to know what is going on. It's time for us to demand reform, especially in the shadow government, and stop this unconstitutional, illegal activity that is happening behind our backs, in the dark, using our tax dollars. We need to stand up now. The American people can do it. We can do it. And now's the time to start.
That was Kevin Shipp, folks. Three things, please. Number one, copy this program. Send it to everyone you know. Kevin Shipp has been. We actually blew through the network breaks. The network was kind enough to allow us to do that. This was an uninterrupted presentation by Kevin Shipp. We thank him for that. I'm going to tell you, to 90 talk that minutes. Long, to talk that long, yeah, it's really a it's a feat. And I want to say thank you. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts as
so
patriots.
Content rich.
Absolutely. We cannot thank you enough. Now, if I know that we have a page and a half of comments, questions, and such from people, but I'm not going to bother you with a lot of those, except to ask, is there anything that you want to expand upon that maybe you feel like you went through pretty quickly that needs more attention, or is there any other topic related to current events you would like to address that perhaps you haven't addressed before? And by the way, folks, From the Company of Shadows is Kevin Shipp's book. I highly recommend it. We have a copy, and again, it's information rich, as is this presentation. Kevin, I'm going to turn the floor back to you for the answer with respect to anything topical or anything you want to spend more time on.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. I want people to understand something that's going on right now. And as I mentioned a couple of times, it doesn't matter what you think of Donald Trump, whether you think he's a patriot, whether you think he's a fascist, whether you think he's a narcissist, whether you think he's just a good businessman. I know one thing is for sure, he has got the shadow government terrified. And you need to understand that what is going on with the Russia investigation and now this ridiculous racism thing is a simple attack by the shadow government to try to take this president out. Because no matter what you think of Donald Trump, as I said, they know he'll do it. They know that he'll investigate the CIA specifically. That they know that he will probably allow the JFK files to be opened up this October. They know with his personality and the way he's been as a businessman and the way he's conducted himself, the shadow government, Clapper, Brennan, Morrill, and the rest of them, Morrell, and the rest of them know that he will do it. And they're terrified. So when you watch this war that's going on in Washington between the shadow government and the elected government, I just want the listeners to understand this is a war between the shadow government and an elected president of the United States. So far, it is an information assassination attempt. So far, it is a character assassination attempt. And it could go even farther than that. There's been some indications. There are people inside, on Capitol Hill, inside the government, that want to take Donald Trump out. So whatever you think of Donald Trump, understand this constitutional crisis and what a crisis this is for the shadow government to want to eliminate the president of the United States. I want people to get that. I want them to understand that, because this is serious, and it's a serious constitutional crisis.
James Comey, the recent revelation that the Senate Judiciary Committee found evidence that Comey concluded 2 months or 3 months prior to his July 5th, 2016 statement of non-indictment of Hillary Clinton, or recommendation of not prosecuting her. Where does James Comey fit into this whole cycle of Obama, Clinton, deep state, shadow government, or shadow government, deep state?
Well, James Comey's resume, frankly, looks almost like a CIA operative. He sat on the board of directors of HSBC Bank. HSBC Bank was used by the CIA to launder money coming up from South America for guns and weapons. It was caught doing that. It was issued basically a few $1 million fine, which was a slap on the wrist for a corporation that big. James Comey was on the board of directors when HSBC Bank was doing that. He was fully aware that they were doing that, and he said and did nothing about it. James Comey moved on to Lockheed Martin. As we know, he was paid $6 million on their board while Lockheed Martin contributed to the Clinton Foundation, and on it goes. James Comey is a deep state man, without a doubt. And the most egregious thing, I think, with which most Americans are outraged by, is he laid out the case before everyone for Hillary Clinton being prosecuted for multiple felonies with her secret server and the top secret information that was on there. I think some of it was overhead satellite imagery of Benghazi. Laid out the case. Anybody less than that would be in prison for a good 10 to 20 years. Laid out the case and then let her go. So that was absolutely egregious. It is clear that former director James Comey is a part of the shadow government deep state without question. And I think it's pretty obvious, hanging right out there for everybody to see. Hillary Clinton was not indicted. One of the biggest miscarriages of justice I think we all have ever seen.
Okay, one last question, and I'll turn it over to you, Joe. Will there be, in your estimation, do you believe there will be any legitimate investigations into Comey, into Clinton, the email server, Huma Abedin, McCabe, Rosenstein, even throw him in the mix? Any one of these operatives? Do you believe that there will be any type of legitimate, authentic, honest investigation into their activities?
Well, it's up to Attorney General Jeff Sessions right now. I think the reason Trump came out with that tweet is Jeff Sessions has got all this information. I understand he's got a wealth of information on the illegalities of the Clinton Foundation. Oh, by the way, the Clinton Foundation was closed down and dismantled in 24 hours. I don't know if your listeners know about that, but they shut that thing, cleared out all the employees, shut the office down in 24 hours. So Attorney General Sessions has all that information. It comes down to him. Watch what he does or doesn't do. It is going to be extremely difficult, not impossible, but extremely difficult for him to carry these investigations forward, the Clinton Foundation, Hillary Clinton and her emails, because of the powers that are arrayed against them doing that. Odds are they won't, unless they want to take a personal career risk and push it through. That's the only way it's going to be done, is if they decide that country is more important than their career or even their personal safety. That's what it's going to take for these investigations to go through. If they're not willing to go that far, then no, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, and Mr. Shipp, we saw, this week a number of stories. One continuation on the Hillary Clinton email story, where it was said by the FBI that due to lack of public interest, they refused to fulfill a FOIA request for Judicial Watch to release some of the rest of the Hillary Clinton emails, citing a lack of public interest. And the attorney who filed the motion said he was astounded at this ruling, and it just shows the level that the Obama holdovers are still in control of the FBI. And I'm sure that this same example and scenario is across the board. FBI, the DOJ, EPA, FDA, and all the way up right inside the White House. This is why when we saw Steve Bannon step down and Sebastian Gorka resign, both issuing letters of resignation saying they would be better able to serve the president outside of the White House, as anti-American, anti-MAGA, Make America Great Again agenda folks are infiltrating and undermining the president in the White House. And he is, in an uphill battle right now. And who knows if there's any way to really turn this around when the infiltration and corruption is so deep. It's like a fruit that's rotten from the inside out. You're not going to be able to put it in the fridge and get it ripe again.
Yeah, I don't laugh much anymore. My wife and I go to comedies just what is it? Laughter does good like a medicine, just for the healthy part of it. But I got to tell you, when I saw the FBI's response to that there wasn't enough public interest for them to release a FOIA, I laughed out loud. It was so ridiculous. It was a clear, bold-faced lie. There is a huge amount of public interest out there. But as you mentioned so well, Joe, that shows you the power that they have to cover these things up. That was an obvious cover-up, and their cover-ups sometimes are so ridiculous, they seem almost stupid, but they know that the public will buy it if they say it enough times. So it's just another example. When I filed the Freedom of Information Act to get my performance appraisals from the CIA so I could put them in my book and stop anybody from, including them, from saying I never worked there, they're supposed to get a FOIA request back in 30 days, and it has to go through different approval processes. 6 months later, they kept blowing me off until finally I threatened them with legal action or worse, publicity, and then I had that thing, I think it was 4 days. They routinely obstruct justice. It's funny, the people that entrap other people, the FBI at their senior levels, for example, for obstruction of justice are the ones that obstruct justice themselves. But of course, that's what we see from the shadow government and the deep state. They will bust everybody else for these laws. They'll commit the same violations and then make it covered up and use the system so that they walk.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. We see this time and time again, regardless if it's the presidential race or something as simple as Prop 8 in California, where the voters voted against homosexual marriage being legal in California, yet the city council and government overturned it. One story about Charlottesville you don't hear is that the city voted 80% to 20% to keep the Confederate statues up, yet the city council, overturned their vote. We're seeing the same thing with the president of the United States. We have the majority of the people voted for President Trump. He won the election fair and square. And now we have this whole orchestration of, political people in the deep state and otherwise trying to overturn the people's vote again. And in doing so, it's not just trying to accomplish what they want, which is the removal of Trump. They are creating this division in this country, this deep division that would never be healed if they are successful in their agenda. And I think that's their ultimate goal, is to be able to create so much chaos and civil unrest that they'll be able to bring in the new form of government which they want, which is antithetical to the Constitution and pro-totalitarian.
I think you nailed it, Joe. I think you're right on target. The old war adage, divide and conquer, and I want to address it. I want people to understand their new weapon of war in the propaganda war, and that's what it is. It's a propaganda war. That's what they're waging. Much of this is funded by George Soros. He wants to eliminate, out of his own mouth, he wants to eliminate the sovereignty of the United States. He's funding some of these groups, Black Lives Matters and others. He's funding them to create division in the United States and break the country up. That's part of this multi-pronged effort to destroy national sovereignty in the United States, and ultimately the Constitution. I want people to understand that this racism narrative is simply a propaganda operation to divide the United States. Don't buy it. Don't fall into it. We also have to understand, too, that these neo-Nazis, these morons that believe in this stuff, are a vast minority of the American population. They're a handful at some of these rallies. And they also have to understand that Nazism is not a political movement. It's actually an occult belief. It's an occult belief in a system of a super race. And these people go in these almost like seances to plug into this super race and others. So the Nazi movement is more of an occult movement than anything else. It is the vast minority. The majority of American people, both black, white, and Asian, and others, they all decry racism and fascism. You can ask anybody on the street, you think racism is good? And they'll say, heck no. That falls into what my daughter would say, duh. Of course not. So this racism narrative is a ploy. It's a propaganda operation. I want people to understand. Don't fall into that, because it is designed to divide our country. So just watch out, keep an eye on it, and don't let them get to you.
Kevin Shipp is our guest and a true American hero and a patriot. Mr. Shipp, can you do you mind talking about your radio program, the Kevin Shipp Intelligence Hour? Tell our listeners about it, where they can find more information about it, where they can hear the archives and listen to you contemporaneously, live, that is.
Sure, Doug. Thank you. It's called the Intelligence Hour. It's on prn.fm. You can go into prn.fm Monday evenings at 6 p.m. and you'll go right on there. If you go into prn.fm, go to host, scroll down, you'll see me there. Click on the Intelligence Hour, and it's got an archive of all the programs that we've done. And the purpose of the Intelligence Hour, our vision, and what we've been doing is allowing people to come on there, like Paul Williams, for example, and giving them the floor. We are eliminating censorship. That's one of the goals of this program, to let them come on and talk openly about what they've seen, what they're involved in, what their investigation has revealed. We'd have John Kirikow on there, had Paul Williams of Operation Gladio on there, and it is an avenue for people to come on and in an open, uncensored forum lay out for everybody to hear what they have uncovered, either in their journalistic investigation or the operation that caused them to come out and be a whistleblower. So it's an open avenue for uncensored information on what our government is doing in light of the U.S. Constitution.
All right, and that's every Monday at 6 p.m. And, of course, we're going to include the link in the program description to your radio show.
Thank you.
All right, and From the Company of Shadows is your book. I do hope you're planning on writing another one.
We are right in the middle of it.
Perfect. You want to give a tease on that one, or not time yet? It's up to you.
Right. It's going to be called The CIA and the Shadow Government.
Okay, and that's going to be a true winner, to be sure. All right. Now you recently did, and this is the last question we'll bother you with, given the fact that you've got to be exhausted from the presentation you've done. But the Obama, right place, right time, not a coincidence. You did a lot of you did a lot of work on the background of Obama and his position as the community organizer president. I've listened to you discuss this. Is there anything you want to say about Obama remaining in Washington, D.C. during the Trump administration at this point? Because I know you've spoken about that.
Yes, it is the continued subversion that Barack Obama has engaged in since before he was a senator. If you go out there on the net, I gave a lecture called The Subversion of America, and I get into Barack Obama in detail and Hillary Clinton and their connections in detail. Barack Obama was a subversive president. He was placed in there with the funding of George Soros and others with the goal of undermining traditional American, ultimately the Constitution, which he and the progressives believe should be, quote unquote, a living document. In other words, changed at the whim of government at the time. So Barack Obama is a subversive. He was a subversive before he was in the White House. I wrote a 34-page paper proving he was a subversive while he was in there. So why would he not continue his subversive activities after he gets out? Of course he continued. That's what he is. He's a subversive. He's paid to do it. He's locked into the subversive nationalist, globalist, progressive movement, and I don't say that lightly. His goal is the undermining of traditional America without a doubt, and they see the foundation of traditional America as the U.S. Constitution as their ultimate target. And that's what the OFA is all about. We need to keep our eyes on that because it's going to get nasty. It's already getting nasty. And the OFA is not going to play by our typical social civil rules. They're going to get dirty. So to answer your question, Doug, Barack Obama is just engaging in the same subversion he did as he went through the White House. He's continuing. That's his goal. That's his mission. That is who Barack Obama is. And with the OFA, he's just continuing in that same vein.
Understood. Last question, then I'll cut you loose. Kevin, what can people do to assist you, your efforts, if anything, aside from buy your book, listen to your radio show?
Well, just keep watching my talks. I mentioned before, my wife and I, sometimes we look out the window and wait for the black Suburbans to roll up. I would just, number one, I'd appreciate people's prayers. Just continue to pray for me and for God's protection over what I'm doing. That's the main thing I think that gives me the most comfort. Second of all, join with me in stepping up and demanding reform of our post-constitutional government. Now, I think if there's enough of us, and there are enough of us out there, if enough of us get vocal, as has been the case with every movement in history, if enough of us get vocal and are willing to take a bit of risk, we can change this thing. So I'd ask people just to stand with me too and step out on their own and start talking and writing and getting into things like that. Probably the best way I think that they could support me.
Thank you, Kevin Shipp. Prayers up, shields up, and we to the extent possible, we have your back. We are going to promote the heck out of this segment. We thank you for your gift of time, your energy. That was the most comprehensive presentation on the shadow government I think anyone could ever ask for, and we applaud what you've done. Thank you so very much, Mr. Shipp.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Joe.
All right,
Thank
sir.
you.
God bless you, sir.
God bless you too, guys.
All right.
And I hope everybody paid attention because that was just a magnificent presentation. Something like when we go to conferences.
That's right.
And hear people speak. This is the quality of information that you would get from a speaker.
Yeah, I just want to say this. I want to thank Todd from Global Star Radio Network for allowing us to go through the network breaks. It costs money to do that. Okay, this is a sacrifice. Okay, so Todd, thank you so very much. John Robertson, thank you so much for setting this up the way you did. Eric worked. Let me tell you, Eric makes it look so easy. It's not. To get the slides on a virtual basis using spreading across multiple platforms and sitting in a spaceship doing what he did, it's not easy. But thank you, Eric, and thank you so much. And then Brent Bileski, thank you, sir. You are a class act, and of course, Brent Bileski brings us Kevin Shipp and Paul Williams, IQL Rizzulli, and others. And I thank Mr. Bileski for all you've done, and we will also put some information where you can personally thank Mr. Bileski as well. So, in fact, if you go to realnewswars.info, there, that's Kevin Shipp's site as well. WorldNetworkSpyTheater.com, but realnewswars.info. And, of course, from there you can get to